So now we're going to talk about cost advantage. Okay. Now, I've mentioned a few of these already. There are a lot of sources of cost advantage, right? The first one is an economy of scale. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that during this video. But an economy of scale basically means the more you produce, the cheaper it is to produce each additional unit. And that's usually related to the ratio of fixed costs, like owning a land, owning a factory, etc., to your material costs. So you want to kind of spread out those fixed costs over as many units as possible. So it's related to materials. But we also have economies, or you could also call them economies of learning. And economies of learning could also be called an experience curve. And that means you think about the first time you do something, you make a lot of mistakes, and then the more you do it, the better you get at it, the fewer mistakes you make. That's kind of like the economy of learning. And this is particularly relevant to products or processes that are particularly complex with a greater number of steps in them. Okay? So as people get better at doing something, they're more efficient at it. And economies of learning, in contrast to economies of scale, are not embedded in resource or material costs, but they are embedded in individual skill sets and organizational routines. So people and the organization get better at doing a certain kind of thing over time. You also have process technology and design. Process technology and design basically means that if process innovation is embodied in the new capital equipment that you buy as a firm, then that diffusion will be rapid. Okay? So if your competitor or your source of cost advantage is linked directly to your ability to buy a certain piece of equipment, then you can guarantee your competitors will buy that equipment too. However, it will be much slower, the diffusion of this competitive advantage, if it lies in workers' know-how, management processes, and company culture. So think about the fact it's very easy to buy the same form of technology and have the same kind of competitive advantage as long as you have the money available. But replicating how people work together and their special knowledge and skill sets, that's very difficult. And one example of this I think is important is Toyota. Supposedly you can go to Japan at Toyota's factory and they'll show you the whole shop floor. They'll tell you anything you want to know. You can take pictures, all that kind of stuff. They're not worried about you replicating their equipment and using it in your own firm. What they know is that their culture of innovation and those processes that are occurring in the factory are very difficult to replicate. So by the time you've built your own replica Toyota factory, they're already 3 or 4 years ahead of you anyhow. You're not a threat. Of course, product design is important too. And I also tend to think of that as particularly important with design for manufacture and assembly. So it's not just kind of the product design itself, but kind of the processes that go behind that product design, the way you've laid out your shop floor and things like that. Your ability to use capacity is also important. In other words, think of an airline like Southwest. One of their great competitive advantages is the fact that their planes are almost always full. They're able to keep those planes full. Other carriers may charge a higher ticket price, but then a lot of the seats are empty. So Southwest gets a competitive, or cost advantage rather. So they're able to charge lower costs, which keeps their seats full, and their seats are full because they charge lower costs. So those things kind of go hand in hand, whereas American can charge more, or United or any of the others. They can charge more per seat, but they're still going to lose money because the plane is not as full, and therefore each flight does not generate as much revenue and therefore not as much profit. Certain hotels are like that too. I used to work at a country club, and that had a hotel next to it, And their competitive advantage was they could always keep those rooms full because they would just keep lowering the prices down. This was before value line, or Priceline and Expedia and all that stuff. So they were able to always keep the prices low, and people came back over and over again because they knew the prices were low and our hotel was always at capacity. Our competitors had very expensive hotel rooms, but they couldn't fill them. So we actually made more revenue overall and more profit because of our ability to keep our rooms full. So capacity utilization. And then there's certain things like input costs. And input costs could be a variety of things. Certain locations are going to be more expensive than others. There's going to be certain ownership of low-cost resources that's important. Unionized versus non-unionized labor, and of course, bargaining power. Now let me just draw out the experience curve in case some of you haven't seen it before. And by the way, you can look at the experience curve or the economies of scale thing in almost an identical way. It's the same thing. So on your y-axis, you have cost per unit. Okay, and then on your x-axis, you'd have output or cumulative output. And it usually, an experience curve or a learning curve or an economy of scale would usually look something like, pen's not, there we go. We usually look something like this. Some curves also look like this, straight, it depends. Okay, it depends on the individual firm, but typically they look more like this. And so what I'm trying to show you here is, think of it again like a nail factory. When you produce that first nail, okay, you have to pay for the whole cost of the factory plus the materials for that first nail. So let's say it's $1 million factory and a nail costs $1. Okay, so that first nail costs $1,001,001, but the second nail costs $500,001. So the cost has already dropped by half. And when you produce 10 nails, it's the cost per nail is $100,000 plus the $1 for the actual nail production. Until you get to the point where whether you look at the curve this way or this way, the cost of each nail is marginal because the cost of the factory or the fixed costs are spread out over so many nails. So your goal, if you're looking at a an economy of scale or a learning curve, is to produce as many units as possible to spread those costs out. And of course you can look at it the same way if you're looking at an employee, right? That employee is learning how to do something and they make a lot of mistakes and they mess up a lot of things and they're really slow. So producing like the first thing is pretty hard. And then you notice that after like a week, they can do, 2 or 3 times the amount that they did before and they're making fewer mistakes. And then when you've got an experienced employee who's been doing that same kind of work for 30 years, they're really good at it at that point and they can just whip the product out right away without really making any mistakes. In fact, they can almost do that production process in their sleep. Okay. So, a couple more things that are interesting as well. You also have economies of scale in marketing and advertising. Okay, we typically think of production and we think of learning curves, but the same thing also exists in production. Think of like soft drink companies. Pepsi and Coke are very well established brands. So they don't have to advertise much to remind people of all the features of the product. Whereas like, I don't know, Mr. Pibb or Dr. Pepper or any of these other ones, they have to advertise quite a bit more in order to attract the same number of customers. Because again, people are like, Dr. Pepper, I don't really think of Dr. Pepper. I'm thinking about a Coke. So it costs that much more. So remember, it can be so for resource costs, learning, or for marketing. So just kind of to sum up a couple ideas on our economies of scale module. The more indivisibilities that you have, i.e. your fixed costs, the greater the potential for an economy of scale. So if you have invested so much in a factory or a lease or something like that, then you may wind up, with regards to the cost of the actual product, then you may have a greater potential of an economy of scale. Economies of scale are generally seen to drive industry concentration, again, because of production costs. Think of microprocessors and flat screen TVs. Okay, those are economies of scale because it costs a lot to produce them. Looking at marketing costs, I mentioned the soda thing. Okay? Marketing costs are very important with regards to economies of scale, especially in packaged consumer goods and foods. And you also have to worry about new product development costs. This is especially germane to things like pharmaceuticals and cars. Pharmaceuticals in particular, you think about it, they've got their R&D teams researching thousands and thousands and thousands of things. And you know that 99% of them are never going to wind up becoming a viable drug. Only 1% do. But you have to have 99% failure, which is extremely costly, to get that 1% that's a success to pay for everything else. If you have just a couple of people operating a pharmaceutical lab in their kitchen table, they'll probably have to get, the chances of them actually hitting a success are minimal. So, or you could look at it this way. Think of buying a lottery ticket. You have to buy lots and lots of lottery tickets in order to guarantee that you win. Same thing with pharmaceuticals. Once you get that win, you hope it pays for all the other lottery tickets that you bought for. So again, new product development costs can also encourage economies of scale. Economies of scale are a major driver of globalization. If you're more interested in globalization, I've got a whole module on it on my channel, so feel free to watch it. But again, you think about why. Because factories have to get bigger and bigger, production facilities have to get bigger and bigger, the marketing, everything. It's go big or go home. Okay? Think about volume and industry structure. Now the limits to economies of scale are important. First of all, if you focus so much on economies of scale, you will lose your focus on differentiation. You still have to find some way to differentiate yourself, even if you are a low-cost leader. Of course, when you have such huge capital investments, that means that you're pretty rigid with regards to what you can do with your capital, and therefore you have large-scale facilities. You've got to worry about complexity costs and also transportation costs. If you get too big, you've got to worry about antitrust costs. If you become a monopoly, then your firm may get broken up. And of course, there's a variety of industrial risks. Maybe certain industries will cease to exist. So you're investing so much in one direction that it can be hard to stop or turn around if you are focusing on cost advantage and economies of scale. So the next thing that we're going to look at is how cost advantage relates to the value chain. Looking forward to seeing you then.